Picture the early 1940s. Across the Pacific Ocean, war is raging. Japan's naval forces have been slicing through Allied defenses with terrifying effectiveness, and the United States understands one crucial fact: merely matching Japan's strength won't be enough. America needs to dramatically surpass it. Enter the Iowa-class battleships. These weren't simply vessels of war. They were declarations of power forged in steel, engineered to demonstrate that America could construct floating citadels with greater speed, superior strength, and deadlier capability than anything else sailing the seas. Creating these leviathans wasn't a spontaneous decision. Intelligence reports arriving in 1939 spoke of Japan's Yamato-class battleships, colossal warships supposedly mounting the heaviest naval artillery ever conceived. United States Navy leadership worried that America's existing battleships, vessels like the North Carolina and South Dakota classes, would prove inadequate against such threats. The solution? An entirely new generation of battleship capable of simultaneously outrunning and outgunning any adversary. Thus began the Iowa-class story. Construction commenced between 1940 and 1943. These warships were intentionally engineered to circumvent treaty limitations. Naval treaties had already crumbled by this point, and America had zero interest in restraint. Each Iowa would push past 45,000 tons displacement, while simultaneously cutting through ocean water at velocities exceeding 33 knots. This marriage of mass and velocity was revolutionary for the era. Conventional battleships barely managed 27 knots, yet Iowa could maintain pace with rapid aircraft carriers, transforming it from mere heavyweight fighter into guardian for the Pacific War's new capital vessels. Even the naming carried profound significance: USS Iowa, USS New Jersey, USS Missouri, USS Wisconsin. These weren't arbitrary state designations, they embodied American industrial power. Every launching ceremony transmitted signals to both allies and adversaries. August 1942 witnessed USS Iowa's launch from New York Navy Yard, a steel behemoth entering the water, loaded with destructive potential. Her sister ships followed rapidly, each constructed at unprecedented velocity. American manufacturing facilities and shipbuilding yards produced steel at scales Axis nations couldn't remotely approach. Understanding just how revolutionary these vessels appeared to contemporary observers is essential. Naval architects had traditionally accepted an unavoidable trade-off: either velocity or protection, never both simultaneously. Iowa shattered this limitation completely. Their streamlined profiles extended 860 feet bow to stern, exceeding 2 American football fields placed consecutively. They resembled luxury ocean liners retrofitted for combat. Hulls sufficiently narrow for graceful wave cutting, yet robust enough to deflect enemy ordnance. This wasn't purely theoretical speculation. By 1943, as American manufacturing capacity achieved wartime maximum output, Japanese admirals started receiving troubling intelligence from reconnaissance units regarding these new American vessels. Complete details remained unknown, but sufficient information existed. Something enormous was approaching, and stopping it wouldn't prove simple. This establishes the legend's foundation. Even before those 16-inch cannons fired their inaugural rounds, the Iowa-class carried psychological significance. They symbolized America's approach, not merely engaging in conflict, but preparing for total domination. Stepping aboard these steel titans, what immediately strikes observers isn't solely their dimensions, it's how engineering excellence merged with wartime urgency. The Iowa-class wasn't constructed as traditional floating fortifications. These represented a revolutionary warship category, blending velocity, destructive capacity, and durability into one fearsome package. By early 1940s standards, this was genuinely groundbreaking. Begin with fundamental statistics. Standard displacement for each Iowa approximated 45,000 tons, expanding towards 60,000 tons, when completely provisioned with fuel, ordnance, and personnel. Despite this tremendous mass, these weren't lumbering giants. Their propulsion system, 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers supplying 4 General Electric steam turbines, produced a staggering 212,000 shaft horsepower. This energy propelled these massive vessels across oceans at 33 knots, surpassing numerous cruisers. Picture a heavyweight boxer possessing a dancer's agility. Velocity proved absolutely critical. Carriers had become naval warfare's new monarchs, yet carriers remained vulnerable without adequate protection. Traditional battleships couldn't maintain pace with rapid carrier task forces. Iowas solved this challenge perfectly. They could sprint alongside carriers, defending against surface dangers while simultaneously carrying sufficient firepower to annihilate anything challenging them. But what about defensive capabilities? Here the design genius truly manifested. Iowa-class vessels carried armor belts reaching 12 inches thickness, manufactured from specially hardened Class A steel. Primary deck armor approached 6 inches, while turrets received up to 17 inches of steel plating. Yet despite this protection, designers meticulously balanced hull configuration to minimize unnecessary resistance, creating sleek, elongated profiles. Japanese officers initially glimpsing them frequently mistook them for enlarged cruisers until observing the gun turrets. Technology provided additional threatening layers. By 1943, radar-directed fire control became a defining advantage. Iowas received Mark 8 fire control radar systems, enabling target tracking in darkness, fog, or at distances exceeding visual range. Practically speaking, Iowas could detect and engage before adversaries recognized danger. Japanese warships predominantly relied upon optical rangefinders, effective during daylight yet nearly worthless at night. This technological disparity only widened throughout the war. Crew requirements were equally impressive in magnitude, and Iowa accommodated approximately 2,700 personnel, essentially a floating small town. These sailors operated everything from enormous engine compartments deep within hulls to anti-aircraft batteries covering the decks. Maintaining them required massive food, fuel, and ammunition stockpiles, sufficient for extended operations without resupply. Across the Pacific's immense distances, this endurance provided decisive advantage. For Japan, no equivalent existed. Their celebrated Yamato-class battleships were indeed larger, mounting heavier 18-inch guns. Yet they were slower, less adaptable, and handicapped by insufficient radar sophistication. Worse, Japan could only construct 2, while America built 4 Iowas during wartime with additional units planned. This stark contrast. America's industrial apparatus could mass-produce giants, while Japan struggled maintaining a few operational. When these engineering masterpieces entered Pacific waters, they transcended mere vessels. They embodied American wartime innovation. Every rivet and boiler conveyed a story about a nation that had mastered bending steel, technology, and workforce into one unstoppable force. Soon their guns' roar would make that engineering brilliance unmistakably evident to anyone hearing. Now we reach what made these vessels truly legendary, their armament. If sleek hulls and powerful engines provided Iowa-class vessels with speed and resilience, the weaponry carved their place into naval history. Mounted proudly atop each ship sat 3 turrets, each containing 3 16-inch 50-caliber Mark 7 naval guns. These transcended mere weapons. They were manufactured thunder. Each gun extended over 66 feet in length, weighing nearly 200 tons individually. Operating a single turret required approximately 100 personnel, from shell handlers deep below decks to gunners and officers manning fire control systems above. It constituted an entire destruction factory contained within one rotating armored citadel. And their projectiles? That's where shock truly registered. The standard round was a 2,700-pound armor-piercing shell, officially designated Mark 8. To visualize that mass, imagine a medium-sized automobile engine, compressed into one hardened steel and explosive shell. When discharged, these projectiles screamed from barrels exceeding 2,500 feet per second. They could traverse over 23 miles, beyond horizon limits. Practically, Iowas could strike enemy vessels long before visual contact. But ammunition variety extended further. Iowas carried high explosive shells, ideal for coastal bombardment. When American forces prepared island landings like Saipan or Okinawa, battleships unleashed explosive shell downpours, obliterating bunkers, airstrips, and defensive fortifications. Beach soldiers later described Earth trembling with each salvo, and even hardened Japanese troops acknowledged these bombardments' crushing psychological impact. The firing mechanics proved equally fascinating. Powder bags, each weighing nearly 100 pounds, were positioned behind shells providing necessary propellant charge. 6 bags were loaded for full-power shots. When ignited, explosions hurled shells skyward with incomprehensible force. Inside turrets, safety procedures were rigorous. Single loading sequence errors could mean catastrophic disaster, and indeed, accidents occurred during later service decades. Yet during wartime, systems functioned with brutal effectiveness. What amplified these guns' lethality was radar-directed fire control introduced in 1943. Mark 8 radar combined with Mark 38 fire control computers enabled gunnery officers calculating trajectories with remarkable precision. Suddenly, striking moving enemy vessels beyond 20 miles wasn't speculation, it was science. Japanese forces, still depending upon optical sights, couldn't compete. This represented one of those subtle technological advances that revolutionized naval combat. And Japanese commanders' reactions? Complete disbelief. Intelligence reports described American battleships striking targets theoretically invisible. To officers trained in close-range gunnery doctrine, this seemed almost supernatural. The concept that ton-plus shells could accurately land from beyond visible horizons was difficult accepting until repeatedly experiencing it. The 16-inch guns transcended weaponry. They were symbols for Allied sailors, they represented overwhelming power. For Japanese officers, they heralded doom. For Marines and soldiers assaulting beaches, they were lifelines, softening ground ahead, enabling survival ashore. With such armament, Iowa-class battleships weren't merely Pacific War participants. They were American dominance drumbeats, echoing across oceans and islands, announcing to every adversary, nowhere offers sanctuary. Early 1943 witnessed whispers circulating through Japanese naval intelligence regarding a new American battleship class. Initially, information remained vague and confusing. Enemy reconnaissance had identified unusually lengthy warships with distinctive silhouettes traveling at velocities battleships supposedly couldn't achieve. Japan had already devoted enormous resources constructing Yamato-class vessels, confident those massive 18-inch guns would dominate Pacific waters. But now, something different emerged. Vessels apparently defying naval design conventions. Among the earliest confirmed observations came when United States forces began convoy escort operations using USS Iowa and USS New Jersey. Japanese submarine commanders reported enemy battleships cruising alongside carriers exceeding 30 knots, seemingly impossible. Traditional doctrine assumed battleships lagged while carriers operated with faster escorts. Yet here were American giants maintaining pace, their lengthy, streamlined hulls slicing through water like predators. Word quickly reached Tokyo's Naval General Staff. Late 1943 intelligence briefings described Iowas as fast battleships, a category Japan hadn't fully contemplated. Their strategic planning assumed battleships would always move slower than carriers, making them easy isolating or outmaneuvering. The realization that Americans had merged cruiser velocity with battleship armor and firepower proved deeply disturbing. By early 1944 Marshall Islands campaign, USS New Jersey had already fired initial combat salvos, bombarding coastal positions demonstrating her range. Japanese observers, even distantly, recorded the immense 16-inch gun flashes and mushrooming water columns where shells impacted miles inland. A shocked officer reportedly compared it to volcanoes erupting from ocean depths. Fear was taking root. Additional shock came from radar-directed gunnery reports. Japanese destroyer captains noted American battleships could accurately fire at night, something Tokyo considered impossible. In one engagement, shells bracketed target vessels without visible aircraft spotting or searchlights. To Japanese forces, this resembled sorcery, when actually it was fire control computers and radar's cold precision. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Japan entered war with doctrine centered on decisive battle, massive fleet engagements, where superior training and bigger guns would prevail. But with Iowas, Americans had redefined combat. These vessels weren't awaiting traditional water duels. They were escorting carriers, pounding islands, and appearing wherever needed with frightening velocity. Japanese high command recognized that even Yamato, despite her impressiveness, couldn't pursue them. As more intelligence arrived, one truth became unavoidable. Americans weren't simply matching Japan vessel for vessel. They were surpassing them technologically and industrially. Japanese admirals began whispering that battleship era might already be concluding, superseded by carriers and radar. Yet simultaneously they couldn't ignore the new reality. Iowa-class existed, demanding reckoning. By mid-1944, Japanese reconnaissance wasn't merely reporting strange horizon silhouettes. They were reporting unmistakable 16-inch gun thunder echoing across the Pacific, a sound carrying both fear and grim acknowledgement. A new maritime sovereign had arrived, and Empire commanders recognized it. The genuine test arrived October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, history's largest naval engagement. This clash saw Japan gambling everything to halt American Philippines' advancement. Here, Iowa-class battleships demonstrated their complete value. By this war stage, United States Navy fast carrier task forces were penetrating deep into Japanese territory. Protecting them, Iowas, specifically USS Iowa and USS New Jersey, were assigned to Task Force 38. Their dual-role shield carriers from surface attacks, and when necessary, bring massive firepower against enemy warships. This made Japanese forces nervous because their decisive battle doctrine assumed carriers would remain vulnerable to battleship strikes. Instead, Americans had married speed and protection into packages Japan couldn't counter. During Leyte Gulf, Japanese forces launched multiple attack vectors. One most dangerous came through Sibuyan Sea, where mighty Yamato and sister Musashi attempted smashing through American defenses. While Musashi would sink under relentless airstrikes, Iowa presence ensured carrier groups could remain beyond Japan's big gun range. Iowas acted as guardians, daring any Japanese surface vessels attempting closing distance. None succeeded. But this transcended mere deterrence. USS Iowa and USS New Jersey employed firepower in supporting roles, bombarding Japanese positions and repelling surface threats. Their radar-directed gunnery meant even during night operations American vessels could effectively engage, something Japanese found profoundly unnerving. Tokyo admirals had believed Yamato's 18-inch shells provided the ultimate advantage. But at Leyte, they witnessed how insignificant that proved when America's war machine fused carriers, radar, and Iowas into seamless force. One striking episode occurred when Japanese commanders realized their heavy cruisers and destroyers were being night-targeted by American radar-directed fire. Not only were carriers untouchable, battleships themselves could unleash accurate broadsides without daylight. Japanese Admiral Takeo Kurita, commanding Center Force, was shocked by American ship coordination effectiveness for long-range fire. Even though Iowas didn't directly engage Yamato at Leyte, their presence shifted psychological balance. Japan's super battleships no longer appeared invincible. Battle's End saw Japan's navy shattered. 4 carriers sunk, several battleships crippled or destroyed, and Empire's naval aviation effectively annihilated. Americans, contrarily, emerged with overwhelming strength intact. At that success's heart were Iowa-class battleships, symbols of speed, strength, and industrial capacity. From that point forward, Japanese commanders knew the truth. Even if Yamato and remaining fleet units survived, they would never dominate again. Americans possessed the superior system, and Iowas were clearest evidence. They transcended mere warships. They were visible proof Japan's Pacific dominant dream had ended. Leyte Gulf wasn't merely a tactical and territorial turning point. It was a psychological breaking point. Japan's naval command had been shocked into recognizing America's industrial scale and technological advantage, embodied by Iowa's, had made traditional naval warfare obsolete. Late 1944 into 1945 witnessed Iowa-class battleships unleashing fury not just against enemy fleets but entire coastlines. Their 16-inch guns no longer served simply for ship-to-ship duels. They became the hammer smashing Japanese defenses before American soldiers and Marines even touched island soil. For Japanese high command, observing these bombardments resembled witnessing natural disasters summoned deliberately. Consider Iwo Jima bombardment, February 1945. USS New Jersey and USS Iowa weren't directly at that invasion, but sister ships Missouri and Wisconsin would soon assume similar roles. Before United States Marines stormed beaches, Iowa's fired salvo after salvo of high-explosive shells, each exceeding 1 ton. Shells cratered runways, toppled bunkers, transformed defensive positions into rubble. Underground Japanese soldiers could feel shockwaves reverberating through earth, constant thunder shattering morale before initial assault waves arrived. Eyewitness descriptions capture these bombardments' sheer spectacle. Sailors recalled observing shells arcing skyward, vanishing into clouds, only for massive smoke and fire plumes erupting miles distant. Seconds later, Marines in landing craft cheered seeing hillsides exploding, knowing Iowas were clearing paths through supposedly impenetrable fortifications. For Japanese forces, however, it was nightmare. Even the most hardened defenders recognized no bunker provided true safety when 2,700-pound shells crashed overhead. Another example came at Okinawa, April 1945, the Pacific's bloodiest battle. USS Missouri and USS Wisconsin joined pre-invasion bombardments, firing thousands of rounds. Entire ridges disappeared under concentrated fire. Supposedly impregnable caves collapsed. Island Japanese commanders reported barely being able to coordinate defenses as communication lines were severed and command posts obliterated before combat troops ever saw enemies. The destructive power was staggering, but what truly stunned Japanese command was accuracy. Radar-directed fire allowed Iowas hitting designated targets with precision, far exceeding traditional gunnery. This wasn't random shelling, it was calculated devastation. Ammunition depots, airfields, artillery positions, all could be systematically eliminated. By comparison, Japanese counter-bombardments from shore artillery seemed like pebbles tossed into oceans. Moreover, psychological weight extended beyond battlefields. Prisoners of war later recounted terror hearing Iowa guns opening up, describing it as Earth itself splitting apart. For many Japanese troops, surviving Iowa bombardments was pure fortune rather than skill or preparation. That knowledge eroded confidence and fed growing realization that war couldn't be won. For Americans, Iowas became reassurance symbols. Troops knew before advancing those massive vessels would soften defenses. Entire operations were planned around big guns' firepower. If an Iowa was offshore, survival odds rose dramatically. That connection, steel giants offshore and flesh-and-blood soldiers inland, cemented battleship reputation not just as war tools, but life protectors. By mid-1945, Japanese commanders were left stunned, not just by devastation but relentlessness. America could fire these guns day after day, week after week, because its industrial base supplied endless shell and powder streams. Japan simply couldn't match it. Each thunderous broadside exceeded tactical strikes. It was a nation's war machine, sound grinding down an empire. By summer 1945, Japan's naval command reached a grim conclusion. No counter existed for America's Iowa-class battleships. These warships weren't just fast, powerful, and resilient. They proved Japan's strategic doctrine had failed catastrophically. For years, Japanese planners had invested everything into Yamato-class, believing 18-inch guns would decide grand, decisive sea battles. But that battle never materialized. Instead, Iowas operated on American terms, escorting carriers, pounding shorelines, and darting across Pacific with unnerving velocity. Yamato herself sailed her final mission April 1945, Operation Tengo, and sank under carrier aircraft waves before even engaging American battleships. The bitter irony proved impossible ignoring. Japan's super battleship had been built dominating surface duels, yet never even approached. Meanwhile, Iowas were proving their worth daily, fighting across multiple theaters with devastating effectiveness. Within Japan's high command, futility sense spread. Reports described how American industrial capacity seemed limitless. For every shell fired from an Iowa, hundreds more waited in magazines and thousands more rolled off assembly lines back home. Japanese officers compared this to their own dwindling stockpiles, where even heavy gun ammunition required rationing. America's ability sustaining Iowa firepower indefinitely underscored a truth. This wasn't merely ship battles, but economic battles, and Japan was already bankrupt. Morale became another casualty. Soldiers who once believed in invincible Yamato steel myth now listened to Iowa leveling entire coastline stories. Civilians too began hearing of these American giants. Even if Japanese propaganda tried downplaying threats, survivors returning from fronts described 16-inch shell thunder and resisting their impossibility. Yamato's aura as national symbol gave way to whispers of Iowa as inevitable defeat symbol. It wasn't just raw power stunning Japan, it was adaptability. Iowas weren't limited to single roles. They escorted carriers, guarded supply convoys, shelled islands, and even hunted enemy vessels when needed. This flexibility made them unpredictable. Japanese strategists could never know where or how Iowas would appear, only that when they did, destruction followed. By July 1945, as B-29 bombers firebombed cities and submarines strangled supply lines, Japanese Navy was effectively finished. Iowas had contributed to that collapse, not by fighting Yamato in cinematic duels, but by rendering her and all like her irrelevant. It was a quiet but crushing blow to Japanese pride. The empire had built the world's largest battleship, yet America's slightly smaller, far faster, and more versatile Iowas had proved superior in every practical sense. The realization within Japan's leadership was clear: the war was no longer winnable. Every thunderous salvo from Iowa-class battleships reminded that America not only held seas but could project power anywhere desired. The decisive battle doctrine had died not in one climactic clash but in relentless demonstration series, showing futility of resisting America's industrial and technological dominance. By the time war drew to final days, the very sight of an Iowa steaming on horizon was enough confirming what many Japanese commanders already knew deep down. The Empire's Pacific supremacy dream was over. When guns finally fell silent, August 1945, Iowa-class battleships remained afloat, not merely as survivors but as icons. For Japanese command, their legacy was awe and dread. For Americans, it was pride and reassurance. These vessels weren't retired at war's end. They carried on, living proof how steel, speed, and firepower had rewritten naval warfare. One moment forever tied to their legend came September 2, 1945. USS Missouri was chosen as stage for Japan's formal surrender in Tokyo Bay. It was no accident. The United States could have used another vessel, but choosing Missouri, a symbol of America's newest and most powerful class, sent a clear message. The war had ended under overwhelming strength's shadow. Japanese officials boarded her decks, humbled not just by defeat but by sheer vessel presence beneath their feet. Even after war, Iowas refused fading away. They were modernized in the 1950s, then again in the 1980s. Rearmed with missiles and updated electronics, they served in Korea, Vietnam, and even Persian Gulf. That longevity stunned worldwide observers. A ship launched in 1942 was still firing weapons in 1991. No other battleship class in history could boast such lifespan. For Japan, Iowa memories lingered. Veterans recalled how their thunder shook islands and broke morale. Historians noted how their existence symbolized turning points in naval doctrine. decisive battleship duel death, and rise of carrier-centered warfare with fast battleships like Iowa as guardians. And yet, paradoxically, Iowa's transcended obsolescence. Even in a world of jet aircraft and missiles, they remained too powerful, too iconic to discard. That legacy carried Cold War weight. As tensions rose with the Soviet Union, America didn't scrap Iowas. Instead, it kept them as visible industrial dominance reminders. When one steamed into port, it was a statement. America could still summon World War II giants and make them relevant decades later. Japanese, watching this from afar, couldn't help remembering how stunned their commanders had been when these vessels first appeared in Pacific. In the end, Iowa-class battleships became more than naval hardware. They became legends. They embodied not only America's wartime might, but also its ability to adapt, endure, and project power across generations. For Japan, their presence was a painful reminder of what had been lost. For the rest of the world, they stood as monuments to a unique era when steel giants ruled seas. Today, preserved as museum ships, Iowa, New Jersey, Missouri, and Wisconsin still draw crowds. Visitors walk their decks, look up at towering 16-inch guns, and try imagining what it must have been like when those cannons roared across Pacific. For Japanese officers in 1944, it wasn't imagination, it was shock and disbelief. And that reaction, born in war, cemented Iowa's place in history. The truth is simple. Few machines have ever captured fear and respect as completely as these battleships did. They weren't just weapons, they were symbols, and their thunder still echoes even decades after the last shot was fired.